and I'm working under Dr. Melkayan in the economics department, looking at perceptions of rational play and IQ. So I want to start off with a scenario. So I want you to imagine that you are looking to buy a new used car. And you find one for a great deal of only $1,000, quite a steal at that price. And I want you to imagine two different scenarios. In the first one, the seller seems smart, quick-witted, they seem intelligent. And in the second scenario, they seem slower, disinterested, not as intelligent. How would each of these scenarios impact your decision to buy the car? For most of us, we would be more hesitant to buy the car in the first scenario. It seems strange that someone so intelligent would choose to be selling this car so much below market price, and we might think maybe there's something seriously wrong with it. Whereas in the second scenario, maybe they just don't realize how much the car is worth or aren't a very good negotiator. What's interesting about this, though, is that in both of these scenarios, the car is exactly the same. And so is the amount of money you're paying for it. All that's changed is your perception of the person you're interacting with. And this has had a massive impact on your own decision. And this is the background I want to introduce, that your perception of others changes your beliefs about how they will behave, which subsequently impacts your own thought process and decisions. This has massive impacts in the real world, because the majority of systems we see involve human decision-making in at least one place. Small social interactions, such as choosing what movie to watch with a friend, all the way up to massive geopolitical conflicts, like Russia choosing to invade the Ukraine. In all of these scenarios, we see human decision-making, and subsequently, all of these scenarios are affected by how the parties involved perceive the other people in the interaction. Our research is focusing in on this, aiming to answer this question: how does a participant's perception of their opponent's IQ affect their own thought processes and decisions? There have been numerous past studies delving into this question. Lambrick looked at how being told your opponent's IQ affected the way people behaved in these longer-term repeated game interactions. So there was a series of repeated games where people could kind of learn over the course of them to cooperate more or compete more with each other. And what they found is that when higher IQ individuals were told they were playing with someone who was lower IQ, they wouldn't trust that they were smart enough to be able to strategically cooperate with them. Or other people would often try and outwit them if they were smarter than them. They would try and behave more competitively towards them. In a second study, Policio Huerta conducted a field experiment where they compared chess players and regular students. Chess players being chosen because there's typically an association that chess players have a high sense of reasoning and induction skills. And what they found is that when ordinary students were told that they were playing a chess player, they would assume certain things about them. They would assume that their opponent was behaving more rationally, more strategically. But then, more interestingly, they would change their own approach. And so when a regular student was told they were playing a chess player, they themselves would play more like a chess player would, more strategically, when compared to when they were playing a regular student. And so again, we see a massive impact in people's own decisions and thought processes based on simply the perception of who they're faced against. Our research is looking to extend this past research in a few key areas. The first is a focus on one-shot games. So these are in contrast to the repeated game I talked about earlier. In repeated games, there's a longer relationship being developed among the participants. And this means that you have to think about the reputation you're upholding, how your current actions will affect future things. There's more accountability. Whereas the reality is a lot of real-world scenarios don't have this. In the example of buying a car, there's no future interaction with that stranger you're going to have. And so there's less research on this specific topic, and so we wanted to delve into it with our project. The next is generalizing some of the past work regarding chess players to a more broader theme of IQ. Chess players were chosen because there is an association between them with ideas of reasoning skills and the like. But the reality is that in the real world, you don't frequently get information about someone's chess playing ability. And so we wanted to take the concepts that were explored and try and generalize them and see if they do generalize to a broader, more useful personality traits, such as IQ, that we can then apply more easily into real-world applications. And the last focus is a more rigorous approach to eliciting the motivations behind why people make the choices that they do. A lot of past research focused more on the end decisions, the end choices people made, and then made assumptions about what motivations led them to it. We want to tackle this a little bit more head-on and look directly at the motivations why people are making the choices that they are. And I'll explain more about how we're doing this as we move on to talk about the experimental design we will be employing. In our experiment, we will have two different groups. The first will be told the control group will not be told their opponent's IQ, whereas the experimental group will be told what quartile their opponent's IQ falls within. From here, the main focus of the experiment will be the centipede game. And this is a frequently studied game in the subfield of economics. And the reason for this is it has this interesting trade-off, where on one hand, you can typically gain greater payoffs by staying in the game longer. You can see the figure on the right and see that generally the payoffs are increasing as you stay in the game longer. And yet, there's a built-in incentive to cheat the system, that you gain a lot more by being the first to end the game. You end up with a lot more than your opponent. And so what this leads to is an interesting dynamic, where if you're behaving purely rationally, and assuming your opponent is too, the best possible choice is to end as soon as you can, to guarantee that you are the one who gets the higher payoff. But the reality is that when we run experiments, almost no one actually behaves this way. And there's a number of different factors and motives for why people deviate from this. The first is simply not thinking to enough depth about the problem, not really understanding the dynamic at play. The second, though, would be developing a trust with the other participant, that together they'll both stay in the game for a while. Lastly would be altruism. If you care about the other person's payoff as well and not just your own, then that might be an incentive to stay longer. And lastly, there's an element of thinking you can outsmart the opponent, right? So thinking that you can stay in the game for a little bit, but you're still smart enough to beat them to it and end the game before they do. We're going to be conducting 3 different variants of this, and the main focus for this is back to what I said earlier about trying to focus in on the motive for why people are behaving the way they are. For example, in the constant sum variant, the overall payoff that both players are getting, the overall pot, instead of increasing like the original one I showed you, it'll actually stay constant. And so this eliminates any motive of altruism for why people would stay in the game. After each of these games, we will then ask some qualitative questions about participants' own decision-making, as well as what they expected their other participant and how they expected them to approach the game and scenario. Armed with this data, we hope to then answer the following questions about how learning the opponent's IQ affects a player's trust in their opponent, assumptions about their rationality, how competitively they view the scenario, and how altruistically they view their opponent. And we also want to look at how these factors differ between individuals who are high versus low IQ. So for example, past research has shown that higher IQ individuals tend to view, if they're faced with individuals who are also high IQ, they tend to behave more competitively towards them. Currently, we've finished the experimental design and are in the middle of working on the IRB and coding the actual experiment software that will be run. Once we finish this, we hope to then perform the pilot and main study, and then at last get into the data analysis and conclusions portion. Thank you so much for listening, and are there any questions?
You talked about informing participants about their opponent's IQ. How exactly are you measuring their IQ?
Yes, definitely. So I have a slide that gets into it some more. So we will be using a metric known as the Raven's IQ test. And so this is a set of puzzles. You can see an example on the screen that essentially involve pattern recognition, being able to reason through and figure out which one should fit in that spot. One important thing to note is that we're not trying to pinpoint their exact IQ. IQ is a very complicated psychological concept. There's different types of IQ. This is simply meant as a broad benchmark to approximate what quartile they fall within. And past studies have shown that this 12-question variant of the Raven's IQ test is sufficient to do just that.
Is there a reason you chose the centipede game as the focus of your research?
Yes, that is an excellent question. So there's a few things that go into this. One, this is a commonly explored game in this subfield of economics. And one of the reasons is the sequential nature of it, this kind of alternating turns between the two players, leads to some really interesting dynamics looking at something called sequential rationality and subgame perfection, which essentially what that means is that you can, to figure out the best move in the game, you can look at some hypothetical later state. So you could say, okay, hypothetically, if we got to turn 6, what would be the best move from there? And using that information, you can say, well, what about turn 5 then? What would be the best move from turn 5? And you can work backwards to figure out what the most rational best choice in turn 1 is. And this approach of backwards induction is a lot of why then chess players were chosen to be explored, because they have good backwards induction skills. And so it provides a good example of reasoning ability in a game, where it's also exploring the fact that while everyone can usually reason this out, almost no one actually follows it. And so let's explore why people deviate from rationality and what they assume about other people when other people will behave rationally versus not.
So what would be an example of a real-world situation where this research could be applied?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. A lot of these concepts seem very abstract. One example would be a scenario such as blackmail. This scenario is largely dictated by the perception that people have of the other people. So is it a false threat? Are they actually going to follow through? Do I need to pay them? And so a lot of the scenario is riddled with fear-mongering and a lot of exploiting the dynamic of how people perceive their opponent. And so if we can better understand this dynamic, better understand the various factors at play, that will then let us hopefully figure out better approaches that will minimize some of the harmful effects of a scenario such as this.